The strip of wallpaper is in a bag on my desk, the kind with the white block for writing the date and the case number. And the case number on it is one I made up, because the real one would let you find the rest of the file. It's a piece about as long as my forearm, faded green with a pattern of small pine cones that they stopped printing sometime in the 50s. On the front it looks like what it is. On the back, in pencil, in a hand that presses hard enough to dent the paper, there's a column of ranger names, with shift times next to them. And under that, a count of food tins. And under that, a list of which bunk each man slept in, and which way he faced. The last line on it says, "I slept on the east cot with my back to the stove wall," and it gives the date, and the date is 3 nights before I ever set foot in that cabin. I cut that strip out of the inside of a wall in a Forest Service shelter that had been locked and winterized and listed inactive for 6 years. The padlock log showed 2 keys, both accounted for, neither used. There was no crawl space under it, big enough to put a dog in, let alone a man. There was no attic. The roof line came down tight to the top plate, and you could see daylight through the gable vents if you stood inside and looked up, and there was nothing behind them. And yet for the better part of 2 months that winter, food went missing out of that cabin, without the door ever being forced. Matches walked off a shelf. The stove ash was warm when the stove had been cold for days. And one morning, there were footprints in spilled flour that ran along the baseboard and stopped at a wall with nothing behind it but 6 inches of log and chinking. A maintenance man named Carl Hess once stood in the doorway of that cabin and heard me talking from somewhere inside the west wall, talking the way you do when you're tired, and thinking out loud. And he answered me twice before he understood I wasn't there. I was 40 miles south in the district office that afternoon. There are sign-in sheets that prove it. He never worked Greywater again. When it was over, I sat in a room with 3 other men, and we agreed to call it human trespass and structural misreporting, and I signed my name to that. And I took the wallpaper strip out of the evidence before the incident commander logged it, and I've kept it in my desk ever since. I'm not going to tell you yet what was in that cabin, because I don't know, and the not knowing is the only honest part of this. I'll tell you how it started, which is the only way I know how to tell anything. It started in November of the year they shut the highway pass early. We had an unusual run of weather that fall. A wet system came down off the lakes and froze in place, and then a second one stacked on top of it, and the upper road into the eastern sector iced over and slid in 2 places before anybody could plow it. There was a man named Dell who ran a trap line up past the old logging spur. An older man, lived alone, and when his sister couldn't raise him on the phone for a week, she called the county, and the county called us. We didn't think much of it at first. Dell was the kind of man who didn't answer his phone in good weather either. But the storms had stranded a few people up that drainage, and we needed a forward position to work out of, somewhere with a stove and a roof, because running crews 40 miles up an iced road every morning and 40 back every night was going to get somebody killed. The cabin was the obvious choice. It sat about a mile and a half off the spur on an old pack trail, on a bench above the north end of the Black Lake, the one that doesn't take a name on the new maps. On the old maps it was Bellwether. The cabin itself was on the inventory as Shelter 4, Eastern District, and it had been built as a patrol cabin back when they still ran men on horseback through that country, then rebuilt at least twice that anybody could document, and finally winterized and closed in the late 80s when the budget for that kind of outpost dried up. It hadn't been used for overnight in 6 years, but it was on the inventory. It had a stove, and it was close to where Dell's truck was last seen. So the district maintenance supervisor, a man named Roy Peterson, drove up with me and the keys to open it. Roy was 60 then, maybe a year or two past me, a heavy, careful man who'd spent 30 years deciding which buildings the service could afford to keep standing. He had a way of touching a structure before he trusted it, putting his hand flat on a wall or a beam, like he was taking its pulse. He had a clipboard with the cabin's last inspection sheet on it, dated 4 years back, and a copy of the floor plan, which I'll come back to, because the floor plan is where this whole thing lives. We snowshoed in from the gate. The plow couldn't get up the pack trail, and there was no point trying. It was a bright, hard day, the kind where the cold sits very still and the snow squeaks under you, and the lake below the bench was frozen black and gray, with the wind scoured off it in patches. The cabin sat back in the pines, a low log building with a green roof gone almost black, a single stovepipe, 2 small windows shuttered with plywood, and a heavy door with a hasp and a brass padlock crusted in old ice. The firewood under the eave was stacked and split and dry, which it should have been, since nobody had touched it in 6 years. Roy checked the padlock against the key log before he opened it. That was his habit, and it turned out to matter. The lock was a Forest Service issue, and the keys were tracked, 2 of them, one on a ring at the district office and one in a lockbox at the shop, and the log showed neither had been signed out since the winterization. The lock itself was iced shut. He had to work it with his hands and his breath for a while before the shackle came free, and when it did, it broke a seal of ice that had clearly been continuous around the hasp. I want you to hold on to that, because I held on to it for a long time. That door had not been opened. The ice across the seam was unbroken. We were the first ones in. The inside smelled the way closed cabins smell, cold and mineral, wood smoke gone to dust, and under that something I didn't have a name for yet. Wet wool, maybe, and old smoke that was newer than it should have been. Roy got the shutters off the windows, and the light came in gray, and we stood there and looked at a room that was exactly what the floor plan said it was. One main room with 2 bunk frames against the north and east walls, a wood stove on the south wall with its pipe going up through the roof, a plank table, 2 benches, a wall-mounted radio long dead, and a field telephone line that hadn't carried a current in 20 years. A door on the west side led to a narrow storage room and, off that, a pantry not much wider than my shoulders, with shelving floor to ceiling. No basement, no attic you could use. The roof came down to the plates, and that was that. It was a small building. From inside it felt smaller, the way log buildings do, because the walls are thick and they eat the room. Roy walked the floor and put his hand on things. He opened the stove and looked in, and there was old ash in it, gray and settled, nothing strange. He checked the pantry shelves and found ration tins, the heavy old kind, beans and meat and powdered milk, dusty, and he counted them against the inspection sheet and made a note that the count matched. He checked the bunks. There were 2 wool blankets folded on the frames. Service issue, gray. He checked the mouse traps along the baseboards, which is a thing you do in a cabin that's been closed, and 3 of them had sprung on nothing, and 1 held a mouse gone to leather. Ordinary. Everything ordinary. We got the stove going to take the chill off so the crews could use it, and Roy signed the reopening sheet, and we snowshoed out before dark with the cabin breathing smoke for the first time in 6 years. I slept fine that night. I want that on the record, because of what came later. I slept fine. We ran the search for Dell out of that cabin for the next 11 days. There were usually 4 or 5 of us up there in daylight, working the drainage and the spur and the trail toward Dell's line, and 2 would stay over some nights when the road was bad, rather than risk the drive down in the dark. I stayed over twice that first week. The second time I stayed, I noticed the first thing, and I noticed it the way Roy had taught me to notice things, which is by counting. I'd brought up a case of food for the crews, the kind of thing you do, canned and dry goods to leave at the cabin, so men working a 12-hour day had something hot at noon. I'd put it on the pantry shelf myself, and I'd counted it, not because I expected anything, but because counting is a habit with me. 14 tins of one thing, 10 of another, 2 boxes of matches, the wooden strike-anywhere kind in the sliding boxes. The next morning, before the others came up, I made coffee and went to get a tin to heat, and there were 13. 13 of the 14, and 1 box of matches instead of 2. Now, a missing tin is nothing. Men take a tin. Somebody got hungry on the drive down. Somebody pocketed one for a long day. The matches were the same. But I knew I'd counted, and I knew nobody had stayed but me, and I'd locked the door from the inside when I went to bed, and it was still latched when I woke. I told myself a man had come up early. I told myself wrong, but I told myself that, and I wrote nothing down, because there was nothing to write down. A tin and a box of matches. You don't open a file on a tin. The 3rd day after that, a winter patrol ranger named Glen Maddox stayed over with me. Glen was young then, maybe 26, a strong, serious kid who'd come up from the southern district for the season because the eastern sector was short-handed. I liked Glen. I want to be careful how I say things about Glen because of where this goes, but I liked him from the start. He was the kind of young man who did the job because he believed in it, who read the old logs because he wanted to understand the country, not just patrol it. He'd grown up with a father who'd worked the service and died young, and I think the work was a way of being near him. He told me that once, late, by the stove. I'm getting ahead. Glen and I were up there together that night, and around midnight, with the stove ticking down and both of us in our bags on the bunk frames, I heard something move in the wall. It was a small sound, a shifting, a settling, the kind of thing a log building makes all night long as it gives up its heat. But it had a rhythm to it that settling doesn't have. It was a sound like weight being moved off one foot and onto another. I lay there and listened to it, and told myself it was the timber contracting in the cold, which it does, and which sounds like a great many things if you let it. Glen heard it too. He said, from his bunk, "You hear that?" And I said it was the building, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "It's coming from the west wall." And it was. It had moved. It had started somewhere over by the stove, and now it was over by the storage room wall, the west side. And it had moved, the way a person moves, who's trying not to be heard, in little increments, with long stillness between. I got up and I put my hand flat on the west wall the way Roy did, taking its pulse, and the wall was warm. I need to be plain about how wrong that is. It was below zero outside, and the stove was nearly out. The interior walls of that cabin should have all been the same cold. The west wall, in a patch about the size of a man's back, was warm. Not hot, warm, like something had been leaning against the inside of it. I kept my hand there, and the warmth didn't fade the way a leftover warmth fades. It stayed, and then, very slowly, it moved. The warm patch slid down the wall toward the floor, the way a man slides down a wall when he sits. I took my hand off the wall and I told Glen it was the stovepipe heating the chinking, which is not a thing that happens but which sounded like a thing that could happen. And we both lay back down, and neither of us slept much. And in the morning, neither of us talked about it, because in the morning, it sounded foolish. That's the thing about that cabin I want you to understand. Early. In the dark it was certain, and in the daylight it was foolish. And that gap is exactly the space a thing can live in for a long time, without anybody doing anything about it. The next development came from outside, from a man I'd never have called a witness if I'd had a choice. His name was Ferlin Dodd, a plow driver and part-time trapper who knew that country better than the maps did. An old man even then, with a face like a boot. Ferlin came down to the gate where I was checking a crew in, and he said he'd seen smoke from the cabin 2 nights running at an hour, when he knew nobody was up there, because he'd watched our trucks come down. He said it casual, the way you'd mention weather. He said, "Somebody's keeping your stove going up there nights." I told him we had men staying over. He looked at me a while and said, "Not those 2 nights you didn't," and named the dates. And he was right. Nobody had stayed those 2 nights. The road had been clear, and everyone had come down. I drove up the next morning with Glen, and the stove was warm. Not lit, but warm, with fresh fine ash in it that hadn't been there when we left, and the firewood count under the eave was down by an armload. The door was padlocked. We had both keys with us. The ice on the hasp was unbroken. I stood in that cold room, with the warm stove, and I felt the first real edge of it, the thing under the wet wool smell. And I started, for the first time, to do my job on it instead of explaining it away. I logged the firewood. I counted the food, all of it, every tin and box, and I wrote the count on a card and taped the card inside the pantry door and dated it. I checked every window shutter and the inside of every frame for any sign of entry, and there was none. The plywood screwed down from inside, the screws painted over with old paint, undisturbed. I went around the outside of the cabin in the snow, and there were our tracks and Furlan's snow machine track on the trail, and nothing else. No human track approaching the building, no track leaving it. The snow lay smooth, right up to the walls, except where we'd walked. And then I did the thing that started the real trouble, which was that I measured. I'd been a fire lookout before I was a searchman, and a lookout learns to trust instruments over feelings, because feelings will kill you on a mountain. I had a steel tape in my pack. I measured the outside of the cabin, all 4 walls, and I wrote the numbers down. Then I went inside and measured the inside, the main room and the storage room and the pantry, adding them across, accounting for the thickness of the logs, which on that building ran a good 10 inches with the chinking. And the numbers didn't close. The inside was longer than the outside, east to west, by a little better than 4 feet. 4 feet of cabin that existed when you stood in it, and didn't exist when you walked around it. I measured it 3 times. I made Glen hold the dumb end of the tape and read me the numbers, so it wasn't just me. 4 feet, give or take an inch, every time. The west wall, the warm wall, the wall the sound moved to, sat 4 feet further into the world from inside than it did from outside. I stood there with the tape in my hand, and I did the only thing a practical man can do with a number that can't be true, which is look for the error. I thought the storage room wall might be a false wall with a void behind it, a closet somebody had framed and forgotten. So Roy came up the next day, and we pulled the pantry shelving off and looked behind it, and there was log, solid log and chinking, the original wall, no void, no panel, no door. The 4 feet had nowhere to be. Roy got quiet, in a way I hadn't seen him get quiet. He measured it himself, twice, with his own tape, and he wrote the numbers on his sheet, and then he drew a line through them, and wrote, "Tape error, remeasure spring," next to them, and I understood even then that he was protecting himself and the building, and probably me, but I let him do it. That's the first thing I let happen. There were going to be a lot of things I let happen. I want to tell you about Glen now, properly, because the next part is his. That night, after Roy went down, Glen and I stayed over to keep the stove warm and to be there at first light for the search, which had stretched out long enough that we were starting to talk in the past tense about Dell rootin'. Glen had the old cabin logbook out, the one that had been left when the place was winterized, and he was reading it by the lantern, the way he read everything, and he found pencil notes in the back of it that weren't dated and weren't in the official columns. Notes like a man counting tins, matches, and a list of names. Rangers' names, with shift times, and which bunk each one took. Glen read me a couple of them, and we didn't know any of the names. They were from before our time, and we figured some old keeper had kept his own tally for his own reasons. I thought of my own habit of counting and felt a kinship with the dead man who'd written them. And then Glen turned the page and stopped reading out loud. I asked him what it said. He said it was nothing. I told him to read it. He held the book to the lantern a while, and then he read, in a flat voice, a line that gave a name neither of us had said aloud in that cabin. It gave my name. It gave my name, and the words East Cot back to the stove wall. And it gave a date, and the date was the night Roy and I had first opened the cabin, except the entry sat above other entries that were clearly older, on a page that had been written before the book was closed and the cabin locked 6 years ago. My name, my sleeping position from a night that hadn't happened yet when the book was sealed, in pencil, pressed hard. Glen put the book down on the table very carefully.
The way you put down something you've decided not to touch again.
He said, "How does it know that?"
Not who wrote it.
How does it know that? I didn't have an answer, and I didn't pretend to. We sat there with the lantern between us and the stove ticking, and I'll tell you what we did, because it's the kind of thing that shames you later. We talked ourselves out of it. We decided some old hand must have written the names of men he expected might use the cabin someday. A guess, a coincidence, my name being common enough. We decided the sleeping position was the sort of thing you'd write about anybody, since there were only 2 cots, and the east one was warmer. We built ourselves a small, reasonable house to sleep in, and we slept in it, and in the morning it held up the way those houses do until the next night. The next thing I have to tell happened with 3 of us in the cabin, which is the only reason I can stand to tell it, because I wasn't alone for it. It was the 9th day of the search. We'd brought up a dispatcher's portable, a handheld with a recorder on it, because the radio coverage up that drainage was nothing, and we were trying to log whatever we could of the daily net for the incident file. The dispatcher running our net was a woman named Pris, sharp and dry, 20 years on the console. The kind who could tell which ranger was talking by his breathing before he keyed up. She wasn't up at the cabin. She was on the console 40 miles south. But the handheld was up at the cabin, on the table, recording. The afternoon the 3 of us, me and Glen, and a sign cutter named Tom Aubrey, came in cold and wet to warm up and eat. We talked the way men talk when they've spent a day finding nothing. Tom said something about Dell's truck, about the way it sat, about whether Dell had ever made it back to it. I said I thought Dell had gone through the ice on the lake, which is what I'd come to believe, and I said it the way you say a hard thing, low. Glen disagreed. He thought Dell had made the cabin at some point in the storm, before we opened it, and I told him that was impossible. The ice on the lock had been continuous. Nobody had been in. We had that conversation at the table over the stove with the recorder running. And then we ate and went back out and finished the day. That night, the handheld came down to the office with the day's tape, and Pris ran it the next morning to pull the net traffic off it for the log. She called me on the landline, which she never did, and she didn't say good morning. She said, "Whose voice is on this after you three leave?" I told her nobody was up there after we left. The cabin was empty, locked. She said, "Play it," and she played it down the phone for me. There was the three of us talking, eating, the scrape of benches, then the door, then us going out, then a long stretch of stove tick and wind, and then, on the tape, in the empty cabin, my voice, low and tired, saying the same thing I'd said an hour before, about Dell going through the ice, word for word, and then Glen's voice answering, disagreeing, the way he had, and then my voice again, saying the line about the lock and the ice. The whole exchange replayed in an empty locked building, except slightly slow, slightly dragged, like a man saying words he'd learned by listening, rather than words he meant. Pris was not a woman who scared. She marked that audio inconclusive in the log because she had to, because there's no column on a form for a building repeating you, and she told me to my face she'd never run that tape again, and she didn't. But she also told me something I didn't understand for a long time. She said, "It got your cadence wrong. You don't talk that slow. It learned it slow." I asked her what she meant. She said the thing on the tape was saying my words, but it hadn't learned my rhythm yet. The way you can read aloud something you don't understand. And that it had Glen's better. That it had Glen down nearly right. I didn't know what to do with that then. I know now. That was the point where I should have shut the cabin. I want to be honest about that. By the 9th day I had a measurement that wouldn't close, a logbook with my name written before the fact, warm walls in a cold room, food walking off in a locked building, an old plow driver counting smoke on nights we weren't there, and a recording of an empty cabin talking in my own voice. Any one of those I could file under error. All of them together were a thing I had no file for, and I kept the cabin open. I kept it open because we still hadn't found Dell Rutan, and because closing it meant explaining why, and because the part of me that had been a lookout still believed that if I just gathered enough good, clean data, the numbers would eventually close. They never close. That's the lesson I paid for, and I paid Glen's life for it, not my own, which is the part I can't get out from under. We found Dell on the 11th day, not in the lake. He'd made it almost back to his truck and gone down in the deep snow within sight of the road, an old man's heart giving out in the cold. And it was sad, and it was ordinary, and it had nothing to do with the cabin at all. That's the thing nobody understands when I tell it. The missing man we went up there to find was a clean case, a tragedy with a cause, a body and a coroner, and a sister to call. The cabin was a separate thing entirely. We'd just had the bad luck to set up house in it. With Dell found, the search wound down. The crews went home. And here's where I made the decision that I will answer for. With everybody clearing out, Roy wanted the cabin re-winterized and shut, the stove cleaned, the shutters back on, the lock sealed. Routine. But there was the matter of the 4 feet, and the warm wall, and a structural supervisor cannot leave a 4-foot discrepancy in a building's measurements in his own conscience, even if he's written tape error on the form. Roy wanted somebody to open the west wall, just a panel of it, the interior tongue and groove that had been added over the logs in one of the rebuilds, to confirm there was nothing behind it but log, and then close it up and forget the number. It was the responsible thing. It was the careful thing. And the man we left to do it was Glen. I want to walk through the last conversation I had with him, because it's the one I've gone over more than any other, and it's the one the report doesn't have. It was late afternoon, gray, the others already down the trail. Glen and I were doing the closing inventory, counting tins, and the count was wrong again, too short, and Glen made a note of it, and I remember he laughed, a tired laugh, and said the cabin had a good appetite. I told him I'd send Roy up in the morning with him to pull the west paneling and check the void, and then we'd shut it for good. And Glen, looking at the west wall, said something I didn't take seriously and should have. He said, "It's bigger over there at night. Have you noticed? You walk past it in the dark, and the room goes on too long." I told him. It was the dark playing with him. He nodded. Then he said the thing. He said, "I don't think Roy needs to come up. I'll just pull the panel myself first thing, and save him the trip. It's 2 screws and a pry bar." And I, tired, wanting it over, wanting the number gone, said all right, save him the trip. Do it in the morning, with the light. I'll send the relief up by noon. I told him to open the wall alone. I want that said in my own voice, in this recording, plainly, because the report says Maddox conducted a routine structural inspection, and what happened was that I told a 26-year-old to take a pry bar to the one wall in that country that I had a recording of talking, and to do it alone, in the morning, because I was tired and wanted to go home. That's the decision. That's the whole of it. Everything I've done since is downstream of those 2 sentences by the stove. I went down the trail in the last light, and Glen stayed to keep the stove and open the wall at dawn. He had his field notebook, his pry bar, a screwdriver, a flashlight, his utility knife, the wool hat he never took off, and a thermos. He radioed the office at full dark to say he was settled and warm and would call in after he had the panel off. Pris took that call. She said his voice was fine. She said he sounded young and bored. He said, "Last thing, tell the old man his number's going to turn out to be a typo, meaning the 4 feet, meaning me." And Pris laughed and signed him off. And that's the last anyone heard Glen Maddox say into a radio in his own voice. He didn't call in at dawn. He didn't call at 8. The relief I'd promised by noon got held up by a slide on the spur and didn't get to the gate until 2. And by the time they snowshoed up to the cabin, it was nearly 4 and going gray again. They found the cabin padlocked from the outside, the hasp closed, the brass lock through it, and Glen's key, his issued key, was not in the lock, and not on the nail by the door, and not in his pack, which sat on the table with his thermos still in it, capped. There was no way to padlock that door from the outside and be inside. There was no way to be inside and have the door padlocked from the outside. Both of those were true, and Glen was not in the cabin. The west panel was off. 2 screws backed out, set neatly on the table side by side, the way a careful man sets screws he means to put back. The pry bar lay on the floor under the opening, behind the panel, where there should have been log and chinking, where Roy and I had both seen and touched solid log not 2 weeks before, when we pulled the pantry shelves. There was a space, a narrow space, dark, running back further than a flashlight wanted to reach, with old lath on the far side of it, and what looked like the back of another wall beyond that, a wall that was not on any plan, that could not be there, that sat in the 4 feet, that didn't exist. The relief crew, 2 good men, put their lights into it, and called Glen's name into it, and got nothing back, and would not go into it, and I don't blame them. And they backed out, and sealed the cabin, and came down, and that's when my phone rang, and the search I'll carry forever began. We ran it by the book, because the book is all you have. Last known location, the cabin. Vehicle check, his truck at the gate, cold, untouched. Keys in his pocket, which meant his pocket was wherever he was. Radio log, his last call at full dark, nothing after. We brought in dogs. We brought in a tracker named Ostrand, who was the best I ever worked with. And outside that cabin, in fresh, clean snow that had fallen overnight and stopped before dawn, there was not one human track that didn't belong to the relief crew. Glen had gone into that cabin at dark, and the door had been padlocked from outside, and there was no track of him leaving, and the dogs would not work the building. They'd work the trail. They'd work the lake edge. They'd cast around the clearing, and they would not put their noses on the cabin walls. Ostrand's dog sat down a body length from the west wall and would not get up, and Ostrand, who didn't believe in anything, looked at me and said, "I've got nothing for you here. There's no track out because he didn't go out." And then he said, quieter, "Where's the door key?" And none of us could answer him. We pulled that cabin apart over the next 3 days. I need to say that, because people think we left it alone, that we covered it up clean. We didn't, not at first. With a man missing, we tore into it. Roy himself took a saw to the west wall. The man who'd written tape error on his own form, and what we found behind it is the thing I've never been able to put in any words a form would take. Behind the panel Glen had removed, there was the narrow space, and behind that space there was another wall, board and lath, and behind that, when we cut it, another, and the cabin from inside that opening ran back and back, 4 feet, then more than 4 feet, then a length that the outside of the building simply did not have, a passage the width of a man's shoulders made of the backs of walls, old wallpaper facing inward, layers of it, decades of it, the pine cone pattern, and under that a striped one, and under that bare plaster, and under that log, as though we were walking backward through every version that cabin had ever been. There were objects in there. A kerosene lantern from before my time. The glass smoked. A pair of snowshoes laced in a pattern they stopped teaching 40 years ago. A coffee tin with matches in it. A folded wool blanket. Service gray. Folded the particular way Glen folded his, with the open edge to the wall, and nailed to a stud, where someone working in that space by feel in the dark would put his hand on it. A strip of green wallpaper with writing on the back. That's the strip on my desk. I read it standing in that passage with my light shaking, and it was the list, the names and shifts and tins and bunks, the old hands first and then, in newer pencil, pressing hard, the men of our search, in order, with their sleeping positions, with what each of us had been short on the day we used the cabin, and then my name and my cot and the date, 3 nights before I ever came, and then below mine, last, fresher than all of it, the lead still bright in the dents, one line, Maddox, west wall, opened it, stayed, not went, not lost, stayed. And further in, where the passage narrowed to where a man couldn't follow, my light caught Glen's notebook, lying open on the boards, behind board and lath that we had to cut to reach, sealed, no opening, and we cut it, and got the notebook out, and his hat was with it, and his utility knife, and the last line written in his hand in that notebook, dated that morning at what must have been first light, in handwriting that started steady and went bad at the end, said, "He has me down better than the others now. We never found Glen." I want to be clear that this is not a story where the body turns up and gives the family rest. There was no body. There was a notebook behind a sealed wall, and a hat, and a knife, and a strip of wallpaper with his fate written on it in the present tense, and a passage that didn't fit inside the building, and a cabin padlocked from the outside with a missing key. There was Pris's recording of an empty cabin, learning my voice slow, and Glen's voice nearly right. There was a measurement that wouldn't close. And there was me, the man who'd told him to open it alone. The incident command on Glen's disappearance was run by a regional man named Hollis Breck, a fair man, a smart man, the kind of incident commander who keeps people alive by refusing to chase anything he can't write down. I don't fault Hollis for what he did, and that's the worst part, that I understand it from the inside. Hollis came up to the cabin, and he stood in the cut-open passage with his own light, and he saw what I saw, and I watched a careful man do the arithmetic of his career and his sanity in real time. He measured it himself. He got the 4 feet that I got. That he got more than 4 feet going in, and he got the building's true outside dimension, and he stood there holding 2 numbers that could not both be true, and I saw him decide which one he was going to believe, because believing the other one ends a man. We sat down, the 4 of us, Hollis and Roy and Pris and me, in the district office, after, and we built the report. I'm going to tell you how a thing like that gets built, because it's not a conspiracy. It's worse than a conspiracy. It's a group of decent, tired people, choosing the only sentence they can defend. Glen Maddox was last seen at the cabin, and was not found. That's true. He performed a structural inspection that involved opening interior paneling. True. The cabin contained voids and irregular construction consistent with multiple historic rebuilds, which had not been accurately captured in the current floor plan, which was therefore marked inaccurate. True, in the way that a true word can carry a lie on its back. Trespass could not be ruled out, given missing supplies and signs of occupancy, and was listed as a possible factor. The audio recording was inconclusive. The measurement discrepancy was attributed to the historic construction and to the difficulty of measuring around log walls. Maddox was classified as disappeared after conducting an inspection, presumed lost in the backcountry, search suspended after the standard interval. The cabin was removed from the overnight use list and slated for closure, and the phrase, "inside the walls," appears nowhere in it, because Hollis struck it, gently, every time it crept in, replacing it with "within structural voids." And he was right to, by every rule we operate under. And I let him, and I helped him. And when the wallpaper strip went into the evidence box, I took it out and put it in my coat. And nobody saw me, or nobody said. Why did I take it? I've asked myself that more than anything. I think because the strip was the one piece that couldn't be filed as anything. A void can be a void. A bad measurement can be a bad tape. An inconclusive tape is just noise. But a strip of 50-year-old wallpaper with my name and a future date pressed into the back of it in pencil is not a structural irregularity. It is a sentence, written by something that knew me before I arrived, and I could not put that in a box that Hollis Breck was going to close and shelve and call solved. I told myself I was preserving evidence. What I was doing was the same thing the cabin did. I was keeping a record of names in a hidden place. I've thought about that too. I should tell you the rest of what I learned, because after Glen I didn't let it go. Not really. I just let it go quiet. I went to the records the way Glen would have. I pulled the building file on Shelter 4, the whole history, every rebuild, every inspection, every floor plan, back to the first one drawn by a man on horseback. And the floor plans don't agree. They don't agree the way you'd expect old plans to. A porch added here, a window moved there. The oldest plan, the original patrol cabin plan, shows the building longer east to west than the current one, with an interior service corridor running along the north side, a passage for storing tack and gear out of the weather, sealed off and removed in the first rebuild as wasted space, 4 feet wide, the exact 4 feet that wouldn't close. The corridor that the building stopped having 70 years ago is the corridor my tape kept finding. The cabin remembered a room it used to have, and it kept the room, behind the walls, in the place the room had always been, and it had been keeping it the whole time, filling it slowly with the leavings of everyone who'd ever stayed, learning each of them a little better, the way Pris said, getting the cadence wrong at first and then right. and the names on the wallpaper. I ran them down. The old ones, the ones from before our time. They were real men, rangers and keepers, who'd worked shelter for over the decades. Most had died ordinary deaths, old age, retirement, the long, quiet attrition of a hard service. But not all. There were two, separated by 20 years, who'd done what Glen did, who'd been listed in the old files as lost in the backcountry near the north end of the Black Lake, after, in both cases, a winter stay at the cabin. And in one of those files, the older one, there's a struck-out note in a margin, in a hand I don't know, that says the man had been reported hurt in the structure after his loss, and someone had drawn a line through it and written, "Atmospheric disregard." Someone before me, in some other decade, sat in some other office and struck out the same impossible thing, for the same defensible reason, and the cabin took another name and waited. The pattern is older than my case. I am one office in a long row of offices, all of us striking out the same line. There's one more piece of the old record I'll give you, because it's the seed of why I'm talking now. In the survey appendix to the original cabin plan, there's a reference to a trail that fed the cabin from the north, a pack route along the survey line, and it has a name on it, a name that doesn't appear on any map drawn since, the kind of name that got corrected off the record in a nomenclature cleanup decades ago. The same name, that struck-off trail name, is written on the back of my wallpaper strip, between the old entries and the new ones, in pencil, as a heading, as though whatever kept the list was filing us under the route we came in by. We came in by a trail that officially does not exist, into a corridor that officially does not exist, and were written down by a hand that officially does not exist. And the man I sent to read the last entry stayed, and the file says structural voids. I closed the cabin. I personally drove the screws. After the search was suspended, I took the shutters and the lock, and I sealed shelter for myself, alone, in the spring, when the snow was off, and the lake was open and black, and the whole thing felt, in the daylight, the way it always felt in the daylight, foolish. I cut a fresh panel and closed the west wall over the passage, and I screwed it shut, and I padlocked the door, and I logged the keys back into the box, and I thought, the way you think when you're 40 and strong and have a career left, that I was done with it. I wasn't done with it. You don't seal a thing that lives in the seam between two numbers by driving screws into one of the numbers. For a long time it was quiet. Years. I worked. I retired. My wife passed. The way these things go. And the cabin became a thing I'd think about maybe once a winter when the cold came down hard. An old guilt I'd learned to carry without limping. The strip stayed in my desk. Glen's family had a service with no body, and I went, and I stood in the back, and I said nothing to anyone, because everything I could have said was struck out of a report I'd signed. His mother is the one who broke me, years on, when she found me after, and said she didn't blame the woods. That woods take people. That's the way of it. She just wished she knew which way he'd gone, so she could think of him going somewhere. and I had a strip of paper in a drawer that said where he'd gone, and I couldn't give it to her, because the place it named was inside a wall, and you can't tell a grieving mother her son is filed in a corridor that doesn't exist. So I let her think the woods took him, which was the kind thing and the cowardly thing. The same thing again, the thing I keep doing. Here is why I'm recording this now, after so long, and then I'll stop, because I've laid it all out, and there's only the end of it left. 3 weeks ago, the service sent a maintenance crew up to the eastern sector to do a condition survey on the old closed shelters, the kind of thing they do before they decide whether to demolish or stabilize. Shelter 4 was on the list. The man who ran the survey was Carl Hess, the maintenance man I mentioned at the start, a careful younger man who'd heard about me and called me beforehand, the way the careful ones do, to ask if there was anything about the old buildings he ought to know. I told him Shelter 4 had a bad floor plan and a history, and that he should measure it, write down whatever number he got, and not open any walls, and if anything seemed off to lock it, and come down and not stay the night. He thanked me. He thought I was an old man with a story. They all do, and I let them, because the alternative is to be the man in the margin, writing things that get struck out. Carl called me 2 days later, and he was not the same man. He'd measured Shelter 4 and gotten my 4 feet, the inside longer than the outside, and he'd marked it and decided to come down rather than stay, the way I'd told him, and he was loading his gear by his truck at the gate in the last light when he heard, from up the trail, from the direction of the locked sealed cabin, a man's voice, tired, low, thinking out loud, talking about whether Dell went through the ice. My voice. Carl had never heard my voice except on the phone 2 days before, and he knew it. And he stood at the gate in the dark, and he answered it twice, before he understood that the voice was coming from a padlocked building, 1.5 miles up an empty trail, and that the man it belonged to was on the telephone 40 miles south. Because I was on the phone with the dispatcher when Carl says he heard me. There are 2 records that put me in 2 places, and one of them is a wall. It learned my cadence. Pris's said it had it wrong, slow, back then. It's had 30 years to listen to the recording of itself learning me. It has me right now. That's what's broken me open enough to talk. Not Glen, who I've carried so long he's part of how I stand. It's that the thing in that cabin has finally got my voice down the way it got Glen's down that last morning. Has me down better than the others now, and it used my voice to call a stranger toward the trail in the dark, and the stranger almost went. There are 2 things on my desk besides the wallpaper. One is the condition survey Carl emailed me, the official one, and on it, in the structural notes, under the line about voids, there's a new entry the service added when they updated the building file from his measurements, an automatic thing, a database thing, that lists the cabin's occupancy history, pulled from the old logs, and it lists the keepers and the search crew and Glen, all of it, and then at the bottom, dated this month, dated after Carl's visit, it lists me. Occupant, Shelter 4, current. I have not been in that cabin in 30 years. The inventory updated itself with my name and a present date, and there is no field in that software, none, where a date in the future or a name out of place can be entered by a person. Carl checked. It's a read-only history field, and it has me listed as currently occupying a building I sealed shut 3 decades ago. The other thing on my desk is the wallpaper strip, which I took out of the bag tonight to read one more time before I recorded this. The way I've read it 100 times, the names and the shifts and the tins and the bunks. Glen's last line, my old impossible entry from before I arrived. I know that strip the way I know my own hands. And tonight, below my old entry, below Glen's, in the space that has been blank for 30 years, in pencil, pressed hard enough to dent the paper, fresh, the lead still bright in the grooves, there is a new line. It uses my name. It gives a date that is the day after tomorrow. And next to it, where the others say which cot and which wall, mine says only, comes back to read this, east cot, back to the stove wall. I have not driven up there. I want that understood. I am sitting in my own house, 40 miles south, with the doors locked, and I am an old man, and I have not driven up there. But I'll tell you the last thing, and then I'm going to turn this off and not listen to it again. Because Pris taught me, you don't run the tape twice. The wall behind my desk, the west wall of this room, the one I put my back to when I sit here, has been warm all evening. Not hot. Warm, in a patch about the size of a man's back, and the night outside is below 0, and the furnace is on the other side of the house. And a little while ago, while I was reading the strip, I heard, on the other side of that wall, very quiet, very tired, a man's voice that was mine, going over the names in a low, steady count, getting the cadence exactly right, and I did not answer it, and I am not going to answer it, and I understand now that the entry on the strip is not a prediction. It's the only kind of true thing that Cabin ever wrote. I came back to read it. I'm reading it. East cot. Back to the stove wall. The plan in the file. The one they updated this month. The one Carl sent me. Has shelter 4 on it. And the corridor that doesn't exist. And the trail with no name. And it has my house on it now too, drawn in at the bottom, 40 miles south, with a small square room and a desk against the west wall, labeled in a hand that presses hard, as the east cot. I don't sleep in the cabin. I never went back. But the cabin, it turns out, doesn't need you to come to it. It only needs to remember you well enough. And it has me down better than the others now.